I was emptying the trash can in the corner office on the 14th floor when I heard the voice on the other end of the phone call say a number that made my hands go still. $340,000. And then I heard the man standing at the window, phone pressed to his ear, say the sentence that told me exactly what he was planning to do about it. Renee's the one who'll take the fall for it. She's the logical name. Nobody questions the quiet ones. I kept my head down and kept working, the way you learn to do after 30 years of cleaning offices at night, invisible in a gray uniform, a mop bucket, a name tag nobody ever bothers to read. But my heart was pounding because Renee Alvarez was the only person in that building who ever said good evening to me like she actually meant it. And I had just heard her boss plan to destroy her life to save his own. What that man on the phone didn't know, what almost nobody in that building knew, was that I wasn't just the janitor. My name was on the deed to that entire 14-story building. Got buried in a contract nobody had looked at in 11 years. My name was still on something else too. Something that gave me the power to walk into that boardroom tomorrow morning and undo everything he thought he'd already gotten away with. If you're new to The Quiet Rise, welcome. We tell true-to-life stories about people who had to disappear for a while before the world finally saw who they really were. If a story like that means something to you, stick around and subscribe, because we've got a new one every single week. To understand how I ended up mopping floors in a building I owned outright, you have to go back almost 30 years. To a garage in a city 2 states from where I live now, where a friend of mine named Arthur Bennett and I built an insurance brokerage out of nothing but 2 folding tables. 1 fax machine and a stubborn belief that people deserved a company that actually picked up the phone when they called. Arthur handled the numbers. I handled the people, the clients, the relationships. The long nights convincing small business owners that our 2-man operation was worth trusting with their livelihoods. We grew slower than either of us wanted, but we grew honest. And by the time we were both in our 40s, Bennett Webb Insurance Group had 400 employees and a building of our own, the same 14-story building I was cleaning the night I overheard that phone call. I still remember the day we signed the papers on that building. Arthur brought a bottle of cheap champagne to the closing, and we drank it out of paper cups in the empty lobby, standing on bare concrete before any of the tile had gone in, laughing about how far we'd come from 2 folding tables and a fax machine that jammed every 3rd page. Arthur used to say the building was proof we hadn't just been lucky, we'd been right about people wanting a company that treated them like more than a policy number. I believed that too, back then. I believed it the whole time Diane and I built our life around that belief, hosting company picnics in our backyard, remembering the names of employees' kids, sending flowers when someone lost a parent. It wasn't performance. It was simply how we thought a business ought to be run, because a business is never really just numbers. It's people all the way down. My wife, Diane, got sick the year we turned 52. Ovarian cancer. Caught later than it should have been because she was too busy running our client relations department to notice her own symptoms for months. I stepped back from the company almost entirely during her treatment. And when she passed 18 months later, I found I didn't have the stomach to go back to boardrooms and quarterly projections. Grief does strange things to a person's sense of what matters. Those 18 months taught me something. I don't think I ever would have learned running a growing company from behind a desk. They taught me how much a person's dignity depends on small things: a nurse who remembers your name, doctor who sits down instead of standing over you while delivering hard news, a stranger in a hospital hallway who holds a door instead of letting it swing shut. Diane noticed all of it, even sick, even exhausted. She'd thank the janitor who mopped her hospital room, ask the cafeteria worker how her day was going. I used to watch her do it and think, that's the whole secret, right there. And I never fully understood how much I'd absorbed that lesson from her until years later, standing in a stairwell with a mop, watching how differently people treated me depending on whether they thought I mattered. I sold the majority of my shares to Arthur. But I kept 2 things in the sale agreement. 2 things my lawyer insisted on, even when I told her I didn't care anymore about any of it. I kept ownership of the physical building through a separate holding company, because Diane had picked out the lobby tile herself, and I couldn't stand the thought of some stranger deciding to rip it out. And I kept what my lawyer called a reserved governance clause, a single retained board seat, exercisable at my discretion, specifically in the event of documented financial misconduct affecting employees or shareholders. At the time, it felt like a formality, a lawyer covering her bases. I never once expected to use it. Arthur passed away 4 years ago. Heart attack in his sleep. No warning at all. His nephew, a man named Preston Vale, inherited Arthur's remaining shares and stepped into the role of chief operating officer. Since Arthur had never had children of his own, and Preston was the only family listed in his estate. I didn't know Preston well. I'd met him maybe twice at company holiday parties, a polished young man with an expensive watch and a handshake that felt like he was already calculating what you could do for him. I started cleaning the building about 2 years ago. Not because I needed the money, though I never let anyone at the company find that out. I started because the silence in my house after Diane died had gotten too loud. And because there was something steadying about physical work that didn't require me to think about anything except the next surface that needed wiping down. I used my mother's maiden name on the employment paperwork, Marcus Webb becoming simply Marcus W. on a cleaning crew roster nobody in the executive suite ever looked at twice. Nobody up there recognizes the man who founded their company when he's pushing a cart of cleaning supplies at 11 at night. People see a uniform, not a face. Renee Alvarez was the accounting manager on the 9th floor, and she was the first person at that company in 2 years of night shifts who ever looked me in the eye. Most employees walked past cleaning staff like we were part of the furniture. Renee would say, "Good evening. Ask how my night was going." Once brought me a cup of coffee from the break room without me asking for it, just because she'd noticed I looked tired. She worked late constantly, later than almost anyone else in the building, and I'd sometimes see her still at her desk at 9, 10 o'clock at night, surrounded by spreadsheets, muttering numbers under her breath like she was trying to make them behave. I learned bits of her story the way you learn anyone's story when you're the person emptying their trash can 3 nights a week and paying attention. She'd grown up not far from the building, one of 4 kids, the only one who'd gone to college. On scholarships and loans she was still paying down a decade later. Her father had passed when she was in high school, and she'd more or less helped raise her younger brother alongside her mother ever since. Now sending him money every month toward his own tuition at a state school 2 hours away. She never complained about any of it. She talked about her brother's grades like she was the one who'd earned them. I recognized something in her that reminded me of myself at that age, before Bennett Webb existed, before any of it, just a person working harder than anyone around them because nobody had ever given them the luxury of coasting. There was a particular night, maybe 8 months before everything with Preston started, when I found her crying quietly at her desk over what turned out to be nothing more than an exhausting week, a broken car, a sick kid brother, the ordinary weight of carrying too much alone. She apologized to me for crying in front of the cleaning staff, and something about the way she said it, apologetic instead of dismissive, told me everything about who she really was. I told her there was nothing to apologize for, that everybody's allowed a hard night. She laughed a little through the tears and said most people who worked in that building would have just stepped over her like she was a spill on the carpet. I told her that said more about them than her. She looked at me for a long moment after that, like she was seeing me a little more clearly than she had before, though of course she still had no idea how much more there was to see. About 3 months before that phone call, I noticed Renee's late nights had changed in a way I couldn't quite name. She started looking over her shoulder in the hallway. Twice, I saw her step into the stairwell to take a phone call, instead of talking in her office, the way people do when they don't trust the walls around them anymore. I didn't think much of it until the night. I emptied Preston Vale's trash can and found a shredded document that hadn't gone all the way through the shredder. 3 inches of torn paper with numbers on it that didn't match the projections I'd glanced. Add in the company's public quarterly filing the week before, back when I still kept half an eye on the business out of old habit. I pieced together enough of it to see a pattern of transfers routed through a vendor account that didn't appear anywhere in the standard supplier list. I didn't know what it meant yet, but something about a torn-up document in a locked office at 11 at night told me it wasn't meant to be found. I started paying closer attention after that. I noticed Preston staying later than usual alone, using the executive printer instead of his assistants. He's always locking his office door even to step down the hall for coffee, something he'd never done before. I noticed Renee's late nights getting longer and her expression getting tighter, the specific tightness of someone carrying a weight they can't set down and can't talk about. Then came the night with the phone call, $340,000, and Renee's name spoken like she was already a foregone conclusion. I finished my shift that night without saying a word to anyone, but I didn't sleep when I got home. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, going cold in front of me, and I thought about Diane, about the lobby tile she'd picked out, about Arthur and the folding table where we used to eat lunch together in that first garage office. Dreaming about a company that would actually take care of its people. I thought about what it would mean to let a man like Preston Vale destroy someone like Renee to protect whatever he'd done, and I understood I couldn't be a bystander in my own building anymore. The next morning I called my old lawyer, Patricia Nuosu, the same woman who'd insisted on that reserved board clause 11 years earlier. I told her everything I'd seen and heard. She was quiet for a long moment before she told me that if what I was describing was accurate, we needed documentation, real documentation, not a torn scrap from a trash can before I did anything that could be construed later as an accusation without proof. That was harder than it sounds. I couldn't exactly walk into the accounting department and start requesting financial records. As far as everyone at that company knew, I was Marcus W. from the night cleaning crew, a quiet older man who kept to himself and did good work. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I found a moment 3 nights later, when Renee was still at her desk, past 10 o'clock. And I set down a fresh cup of coffee next to her without being asked, the same kindness she'd once shown me, and I asked her gently if she was okay. She looked up at me like she hadn't been asked that question by anyone in weeks. And then, maybe because I was just the janitor, and janitors are safe in a way coworkers aren't, or maybe because she simply couldn't hold it in anymore, she told me everything. She'd discovered the discrepancy almost 4 months earlier, a vendor account that had been receiving payments for services no department could account for. When she'd flagged it through the proper internal channel, Preston had told her he'd look into it personally and asked her not to escalate it further while he handled a sensitive vendor relationship. She'd trusted him at first because he was her superior and because the amount back then had still been small enough to explain away as an accounting error. But the transfers kept happening, larger each time, and 2 weeks ago Preston had called her into his office and told her, without quite saying it outright, that if anyone from the audit committee asked questions, it would be easier for everyone if the discrepancy was attributed to a processing error on her end, something she could quietly correct before the books closed for the merger review. She told me she'd refused. She told me that was the night everything had changed. The late nights, the locked door, the feeling of being watched every time she left her desk. She said she hadn't told anyone because Preston was Arthur Bennett's nephew, practically royalty in that building. And she was a 31-year-old accounting manager with a mortgage and a little brother in college she was helping support. She said she didn't think anyone would believe her over him. I told her I believed her. She looked at me the way you look at someone offering you a rope you're not sure will hold your weight, grateful and terrified at the same time. I asked her if she still had any of the original records, the ones from before Preston asked her to look the other way. She hesitated for a long moment, and then she told me she did. Backed up on a personal drive at home, because some instinct in her, even months ago, had told her to keep a copy of everything just in case. I asked her to bring that copy to Patricia's office the next afternoon, and I told her as gently as I could that I needed her to trust me on something even bigger than that, something I wasn't ready to explain yet. I told her I might be able to help her in a way she wouldn't expect. I didn't tell her how. Not yet. I wanted her walking into that meeting with the truth already secured, before she had to process the strange fact that the man with the mop had more power in that building than the man threatening her career. Patricia and I spent the following week building the case properly. Renee's backup records showed a clean history until roughly 5 months earlier. Right around the time company-wide chatter had started about a potential merger with a larger regional insurance group, an acquisition that would have brought a much closer look at the company's books than anyone at Bennett Webb was used to. Patricia pulled the vendor account records through channels that didn't require anyone in accounting to know she was looking, and found that the account in question traced back to a small consulting firm registered at a residential address that, after some careful digging, turned out to belong to Preston Vale's brother-in-law. Patricia called me on a Thursday evening with what she'd found, and I remember standing in my kitchen listening to her lay it out, feeling something I hadn't felt in 2 years, a kind of sharp, focused clarity that grief had buried without my noticing. She told me the consulting firm had no employees, no physical office, nothing but a bank account that received transfers roughly every 3 weeks, and immediately moved most of the funds into a personal account belonging to Preston's brother-in-law, who then, based on public records Patricia could access, appeared to be paying down a significant home equity loan that had ballooned after a stretch of missed payments the previous year. It didn't take much imagination to connect the dots. Preston needed money quietly and quickly. and he'd found a way to bleed it out of a company that trusted him because of a name on his birth certificate. The picture that emerged wasn't complicated once you saw the whole thing. Preston had been funneling company funds through a fake consulting arrangement for months, likely to cover personal debts Patricia's contacts suggested were tied to a failed investment. Preston had made without telling anyone, and the upcoming merger audit was about to expose it whether he wanted it to or not. Rather than come forward, he'd decided the safest path was to make sure the discrepancy had someone else's name attached to it before the auditors ever looked twice. I want to be honest about something. Part of me wanted to walk straight into his office and tell him exactly who I was, and exactly what I thought of a man willing to destroy an innocent woman's career to protect his own mistake. But Patricia reminded me of something I already knew from 30 years of running a company the right way. If you move too early, a man like that has time to clean up the evidence, blame someone else, or simply resign quietly and disappear with what's left of his reputation intact, leaving Renee's name attached to a story that never gets properly corrected. We needed to move at the moment it would do the most good, which meant waiting for the audit committee meeting already scheduled 2 weeks out, the meeting where Preston intended to present the resolved discrepancy with Renee's name on the correction. Those 2 weeks were some of the hardest of my life, harder than I expected, because every night I still had to push my cart down that hallway. Still had to nod politely at Preston Vale when he worked late. Still had to watch Renee grow paler and more exhausted by the day while knowing what I knew and not yet being able to say it. I kept working my shifts. I kept emptying trash cans. I kept being invisible, because invisibility, for the first time in my life, had become useful. There was one night about 5 days before the meeting, when Preston stayed unusually late and I found myself alone with him in the elevator. Both of us silent, him scrolling through something on his phone, me holding my cart steady against the wall. He glanced at me once, the way you glance at a lamp or a coat rack, and said nothing. And I remember standing there thinking that in less than a week, this same man was going to look at me and see, for the first time, a person capable of ending everything he'd built his entire adult identity around. It was strange, carrying that knowledge in silence. Strange, and if I'm being honest, a little bit satisfying in a way I wasn't proud of, but couldn't entirely talk myself out of feeling. I called Renee once during that stretch, using a number Patricia had gotten from her employee file with her permission, just to check in without giving anything away. She sounded exhausted but steady. The way people sound when they've decided to keep standing, even though they're not sure the ground underneath them is solid. She told me she'd started looking at other job listings quietly, just in case, because she'd rather leave on her own terms than get pushed out on someone else's lie. I told her to hold off a little longer if she could. I didn't tell her why. She said okay, in a voice that told me she was trusting me on faith alone, and something about that trust settled into my chest and stayed there for days afterward. The morning of the audit committee meeting, I put on a suit for the first time in almost 2 years. Patricia met me in the lobby, the same lobby with Diane's tile still on the floor, and told me the documentation was airtight, the account traced, the timeline clear. Renee's original records time-stamped well before any of Preston's alterations. We walked into that boardroom together and I watched the exact moment recognition cross the faces of the 6 people seated around that table. The moment they understood that the man walking in beside their outside counsel wasn't a stranger being escorted in for some unrelated reason. He was Marcus Webb, co-founder, majority holder of the building they were sitting in, and the retained board seat nobody in that room had thought about in 11 years. Preston's face went through something I've thought about many times since. Confusion first, then a kind of scrambling recalculation. Like a man trying to remember every conversation he'd had within earshot of a security camera or an open door. He started to speak. Something about being glad I'd finally decided to take an interest again. His voice a little too smooth. For a man who'd just watched his entire plan collapse in front of him. He tried a joke. Something about the janitorial staff cleaning up more than trash cans these days. And nobody at the table laughed, which seemed to unsettle him more than anything I'd said so far. I let him finish. Then I asked the audit committee chair for permission to present documentation relevant to the discrepancy on the agenda, and Patricia distributed copies around the table. I didn't raise my voice, I'd found, over a long career and an even longer life. Raising your voice mostly just tells people you're afraid the truth isn't strong enough to stand on its own. I laid out the timeline, the vendor account, the residential address tied to Preston's brother-in-law, the pattern of transfers escalating in the months before the merger audit, Spore in Renee's original untouched records, proving beyond any reasonable argument that she had flagged the discrepancy through proper channels months before Preston asked her to quietly absorb the blame for it. One of the board members, a longtime director named Harold Ostrander, who'd known Arthur since business school, asked Preston directly whether he denied instructing Renee to attribute the discrepancy to a processing error. I watched Preston's jaw work for a moment before he said that he'd only suggested it as a way to avoid unnecessary panic ahead of the merger, that he'd intended to correct the record properly once things settled down. Harold asked him quietly whether he had any documentation showing that intention anywhere, an email, a memo, anything at all. Preston didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't one. Intentions you only claim after you've been caught rarely come with a paper trail. Preston tried for a while to argue it was a misunderstanding, that the consulting arrangement was legitimate, that Renee had simply misfiled the original correction. But numbers, laid out cleanly in front of people whose job is to read numbers for a living, have a way of speaking louder than a man's confidence in his own explanation. Within 20 minutes, the committee chair asked Preston to step outside while they discussed next steps, and I watched him walk out of that room, looking for the first time since I'd met him, genuinely small. He was placed on administrative leave that same afternoon, pending a full independent investigation. I later learned the missing funds, once properly traced, came to just under $400,000. More than what I'd overheard on that first phone call, accumulated over almost 7 months. Preston resigned 2 weeks later rather than face the board's formal findings, and the company's outside counsel indicated the matter would likely be referred for further review given the scale of it, though how that eventually resolved wasn't something I felt was mine to chase after. My part in it was making sure the truth got into the right hands before it could be buried under someone else's name. Renee found out who I really was in that same meeting, and I want to tell you honestly, I've never forgotten the look on her face. It wasn't relief exactly, or not only relief, it was something closer to disbelief. Like her entire understanding of the last several months had just been rearranged in front of her. She didn't say anything to me until we were both outside the boardroom, standing near the elevators where I'd wheeled my cart 100 times before, and then she just asked quietly why. Why hadn't I told her sooner? Why had I spent 2 years pushing a cleaning cart through a building I owned? I told her the truth. I told her that after Diane died, I didn't know how to be Marcus Webb, founder and owner anymore. I didn't know how to sit behind a desk, pretending numbers mattered to me the way they used to, when the person I built all of it for wasn't there to share it with. Cleaning that building at night gave me something to do with my hands and my grief that didn't require me to perform anything for anyone. And somewhere in those 2 years of being invisible, I found something I hadn't expected to find, which was a version of myself that still cared about doing right by people, even when nobody was watching, maybe especially when nobody was watching. I told her that she was the reason I'd remembered that. Her good evenings, her coffee. The kind of decency that costs a person nothing and means everything to the one receiving it. I told her that watching Preston try to destroy that decency to cover his own mistake was the first thing in 2 years that had made me want to put a suit back on. The board asked me, in the weeks that followed, to step back into a more active role, at least temporarily, while they searched for permanent leadership to replace Preston. I agreed, on one condition. I wanted Renee promoted to interim director of finance, not as a consolation prize, but because she'd shown more integrity under pressure than anyone else in that building, including people with far more seniority and far less to lose. The board didn't argue. Her own record, once anyone actually looked at it properly, made the case for itself. She came to see me in the small office I'd started using again on the top floor. The same office I hadn't set foot in since Diane's funeral, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before she said anything at all. She told me she still couldn't quite picture me behind that desk instead of behind a mop cart. And I told her honestly that some nights, neither could I. She asked if I was going to stay on permanently, and I told her I wasn't sure yet, that grief had taught me not to make promises about the future I wasn't ready to keep. What I did know, I told her, was that I wasn't going anywhere until the company had leadership in place that deserved the people working underneath them, starting with her. She thanked me, and then, almost as an afterthought, she said something that I've held on to ever since. She said that for months. Mine had been the only voice in that building that made her feel like a person instead of a liability waiting to be dealt with. I told her that was exactly backwards, that she'd been the one doing that for me. Every single evening for 2 years, long before either of us had any idea what the other one was carrying. I still clean sometimes, on nights when the house feels too quiet and my hands need something to do. Renee knows now, of course, and she never once acts strange about it. Never treats me differently than she did when she thought I was just a night janitor named Marcus W., if anything. I think that's the thing I'm proudest of in this whole story. She was kind to a man she believed had nothing to offer her, simply because kindness was who she was, long before she had any idea who I turned out to be. The rest of the cleaning crew found out eventually too, the way news travels through a building faster than any memo ever could. A few of them treated me differently for a week or two, more careful, more formal, until I made a point of showing up for the next few shifts exactly as I always had, mop in hand, working the same floors in the same order. Eventually, most of them settled back into treating me like Marcus. It's just Marcus, which was honestly all I ever wanted from any of it. I think about Preston sometimes, not with much bitterness anymore, just with a kind of weary understanding of how icily fear and pride can talk a person into believing the only way out of a mistake is a bigger one. I hope, wherever he's rebuilding his life now, he eventually learns the lesson the easy way. The way that doesn't require destroying someone else first. I think, too, it's about how differently this could have ended if Renee had been the kind of person who ignored a tired old man with a mop cart. It's the kind of person who saved her good mornings and good evenings for people whose titles made them worth the effort. I don't say that to flatter myself. I say it because it's true, and because I think it's a truth a lot of people forget in the middle of busy, ambitious lives. You genuinely do not know, most days, who is standing quietly in front of you, or what they might someday be able to do for you, or more importantly, what kind of person you're revealing yourself to be in the way you choose to treat them. Mostly, though, I think about Diane and about that garage with the folding tables, and about how strange it is that the thing that finally brought me back into the world wasn't a boardroom decision at all. It was a cup of coffee offered by someone who had no idea who I was, simply because she thought a tired old man could use one. That's the part of this story I keep coming back to. The reminder that the way you treat people who seem to have nothing to offer you is very often the only real test that matters, because you never truly know who's standing in front of you until long after the moment has passed. So I'll ask you the same question I've been asking myself since that night with the trash can and the phone call. If you'd overheard what I overheard, would you have moved right away, or would you have waited? Quietly the way I did, until you had the truth solid enough in your hands that nobody could argue it away. I'd love to hear your answer in the comments below. And if this story reminded you of your own quiet rise, or someone else's, share it with a person who needs to hear it today. Sometimes the people who deserve the most credit are the ones nobody bothers to look at twice. And I think that's worth remembering long after the credits roll on a story like this one. Thank you for spending time with The Quiet Rise. I'll see you in the next story.